Hi, good morning, Connect Church. It is really great to be here this morning speaking on perspective, which is the final habit of highly connected people. And I'm really excited to speak on this. I'm a bit of a big picture girl, and I think that understanding God's perspective has been transformational multiple times in my life. When I have got myself into situations where I've become very focused on myself and what I'm doing, and actually when I've stepped back and taken his perspective, it has really, really helped. So I'm going to be looking about perspective in terms of the historical church and how understanding our history helps change our perspective, which in turn changes how we view things, and then also our current social context, both here in Scotland and the wider world. But before I do any of that, I think the key thing to say is that if we're going to talk about perspective, the absolute perspective that we need to get right is our understanding of God. And in particular, our understanding of our position relative to him. This is something we've talked about a lot in church. I'm not going to do a huge amount of detail, but in the book, when we're looking at Moses, he has that amazing burning bush experience where God reveals himself as the great I am. And that revelation and that understanding of who God is and where Moses sits in relation to that is absolutely critical in terms of everything that Moses goes on to do. He constantly and always understands that it's God who changes things. He understands God's power, and that is what gives him the faith to do what he then must do. And I suppose that's my first gentle challenge to you this Sunday, is have a think. Spend a bit of time with God, and make sure that you've got his perspective in your current situation and your current life, that you haven't let whatever it is that you're doing become your perspective and what you're focusing on. And also make sure that you haven't inadvertently, as I very frequently do, sort of taken on the responsibility for doing things when in fact it's always God's responsibility. So the next perspective I want to look at is the historical perspective. I suspect it surprises nobody that I love church history. And if I could encourage you, if you've never really looked into church history, if you don't really understand what it's all about, if I could encourage you to consider doing that. For me, it's been one of the most helpful things that I've done other than reading the Bible in terms of helping me understand who God is and how he works. And I think it's just such an encouraging thing to see how again and again throughout the time of the church, God has continually intervened and cared about humanity and cared about how his character is represented. So the first thing that I think understanding church history does is it takes away any danger of us considering that we're the main event. I think there's a real danger, particularly in the Western world, that we have maybe not a conscious, maybe it's more of a subconscious, but a sort of kind of expectation that history is really just a bit of a backdrop to the main event, which is our lives and our awesomeness. And what reading church history does, for me in particular, is it helps you recognise that you are part of a story, and it's an ongoing story. And it's a story that has been, and it is a story that will continue to be after you go. And you are part of that. You're playing into the long-term story that God is telling about his kingdom and his people. And that is super exciting. But it also helps you to keep yourself in perspective, to not think that you're the main event, that what's happening to you is more important than what's ever happened to other people. History is so valuable, first of all, in terms of encouraging us when we look at things that have happened before, but also in terms of if we choose to see it, recognising the warnings, recognising that there's very rarely any new thing under the sun. And that if we understand that, it helps keep ourselves and our revelations in perspective. The second thing church history does is it teaches us that the church has changed. I think that when I first became a Christian, I didn't really go to church very much, so I had a very patchy understanding of most things. And in my head, which I hadn't really thought through, I kind of thought there was the early church, which was obviously awesome and amazing. And then the Reformation, which happened, which was awesome and amazing. And almost like really once that happened, that's when church really started to happen. And that post the Reformation, that's when God was really moving and really doing things. Now, clearly that's rubbish. And I didn't really think about it much. And clearly the early church and the Reformation are very important things that we need to understand. We need to understand them in perspective. Because I think what that left me with was this kind of expectation that maybe the sort of 1200, 1300 years before, God didn't really do very much. The church didn't really do very much. Actually, when you look at it properly, what you realise is that again and again, about every 100 to 200 years, God rises up a new thing. All the way through church history, whether you're looking at the big things or the small things. And very often, the new thing arises from when the church has either become corrupted or when they have lost their way slightly, or even when they have actually started to disconnect and not reach the vast amount of the population that Christ came and died for. So actually, the change that we're experiencing is actually something that the church has experienced again and again and again over the last 2,000 years. The church has always been changing, it is changing, it will continue to change. And the key things for us, and this is where church history is very helpful, is to recognise what are the fundamental things, like prayer, preaching, discipleship, that are constant. And what are the other things that are more substance things or style things that are not so important? I think having an understanding of our place in the ever-changing face of church can be really helpful and reassuring in a season of transition which we're in. Finally, for me, what the historical church can teach us is actually the purpose of the church. When we look at the early church, and we've talked about this before, we realise that Christ didn't say to his disciples, go and create a gathered group and a hierarchical structure. He said, go and make disciples in all the nations. The key calling of the church is to make disciples. And I think what for me, what understanding church history can do is it can help you to understand the things that you think are key tenets and part of what it is to be a Christian actually sometimes can be things that have only really become big deals in the last while. So for example, this idea of accepting Jesus into your heart is really something that has become a big deal in the last 50 to 100 years. When you look at the historical church, actually, they saw conversion very much coupled with discipleship. You didn't have one without the other. You look at the early church, they call people to repent and follow Jesus. And it's a double thing. You don't get one without the other. And it's really only actually the sort of Billy Graham crusades, which I'm a huge fan of, is when this idea of the sinner's prayer and of accepting Jesus into your heart sort of became a bigger and bigger thing. Now, that is not necessarily a wrong thing at all. But what I'm saying is that actually, in our current church context, I think a lot of the time we have separated conversion and discipleship. We've seen them as two very different things. Whereas when we look at church history, and particularly these church movements that are exciting and that multiply and that bring refreshment and revival, conversion and discipleship go hand in hand. You don't get one without the other. People are called to accept Jesus as their Saviour, but also as their Lord. And I think it's really important, particularly in our time, that we make sure when we're preaching the gospel, we're telling people about Jesus, we're actually explaining that it's a lifelong commitment, that it's a lifelong decision that people are making. So that discipleship is what I was explaining the last time I preached, that Engel scale, where on the one side you have people who really are very far from God and maybe even hate him, all the way through to people who are all the way through to an ever closer and mature relationship with Christ. And what you see when you look at the historical church is that they're aware of that and they work people through that. Whereas sometimes in our current context, I feel that we look at this line, have you accepted Jesus into your life? And we look at trying to get people from here across this line. But the problem with only focusing on this line is that we miss the people over here who actually need us to be going out and to do things, to demonstrate and to sort of start to gently challenge some of their assumptions that they have about Christ and about who he is. And then that needs time and it needs relationship built. as we try and bring them closer and closer towards who Jesus is. And if we have that as our aim, that works. But if we're trying to get people across this line that they're so far away from, well, that won't work. Also, in addition, when all we do is focus on this line, we forget that actually once people are across this line, we need to be discipling them to closer and closer and closer relationship with God. And so I think this perspective of actually recognising that what we're trying to do is to tell people about Jesus, and tell people about accepting Jesus as Saviour, but also as Lord, is really, really important. This idea that the purpose of the church is actually to move people along this line, and we need to include everyone, not just that conversion experience. That conversion is important, I'm not saying it's not, but we need to have a perspective of the whole process that people will go through, from a place of not knowing God, maybe even being really antagonistic towards God, all the way through to a close and mature relationship with Jesus. The final perspective that I want to look at is our current social context. So those are the things that the historical church can teach us, but our current social context is really important. Now, I had what I thought was a really great visual thing, but it actually doesn't work. So I'm just going to have to tell you my statistics, and I will email them to the house church leaders if you're wanting them written down. I'll also email a copy of the Engel diagram in case what I was saying back there wasn't making sense to you. So, the first statistic that I want you to know about Scotland today is that when surveyed, 9% of people go to church regularly. I think it's really important to note that to qualify as a regular churchgoer, you need to go at least once a month. So it's a pretty low standard. So 9% of the population go to church regularly. By that we mean once a month. However, when you narrow that down to the proportion of people who are Bible-believing Christians, that number drops considerably to 2%. So 2% of the Scottish population consider themselves Bible-believing Christians. What that means is that we, technically, could call Scotland an unreached population. We're getting close to the threshold that you need to reach to be an unreached population. That's quite sobering. That's quite important, I think, for us to know when we look around our country, because I hear a lot of Christians, but actually mostly non-Christians, talk about how Scotland and the UK are Christian countries, when the statistics would suggest they're really not. And actually, while in a way that's a bit depressing, it's also really exciting, because my goodness, there is a mission field out there if we're willing to go there. So the next statistic that's important is a recognition that if the church did everything it can do, that we know it works in terms of the attractional model, in terms of bringing people in. Every church did that to the best of their ability. So we essentially had lots of your sort of Destiny, Queen Park kind of style churches, which had lots of staff, lots of coffee, lots of cool music, lots of events going on to bring people in. If every church in Scotland did that, we would only ever be able to reach 15% of the population. So I'm just going to repeat that. We would only ever be able to reach 15% of the population doing church as we currently do it. For 85% of our population, church is the barrier to knowing God and Jesus. For 85% of the church, they have no interest in getting involved in church. Now, some of that proportion hate us. Some of that proportion have a very, very good reason to hate us. But actually, for an awful lot of people, we're just completely irrelevant. If we speak to them, they will smile politely, but we're just not relevant to them. Now, what's very interesting is a significant proportion of that population, that 85%, are interested in Jesus. A significant proportion of that population consider themselves spiritual. But the idea of religion or Christianity is really off-putting for them. So I think that when we look at church and what we do, understanding the perspective that those statistics give us is absolutely crucial in terms of the decisions that we choose to make in how we do church. Because if we don't change or do things differently, then we're all going to be competing for the same 15% of the population who are willing to listen. Actually, we need to be going out to that 85% and helping them understand more of who Jesus is and moving them along that diagram towards a closer relationship and understanding of God. So that's our current context in Scotland. But in terms of globally, when we look at the church, and I think this perspective is important too, the fastest growing church just now currently is in Iran. And that's not uncommon. I think we all know that we're seeing this massive church growth in these persecuted churches. And some of that is completely understandable in that when you are persecuted, you don't have the time or the energy to spend on things that are not important. Everything gets stripped away until you have the absolute fundamentals of your faith and what it means. And that creates a zeal and a passion that I think is very evident when you look at these churches. So if we look particularly at this church in Iran, because I think there's some key things that we in the West can learn here. The first thing is what I was saying right at the start. This is a church that totally relies on God. They meet in groups, they pray and fast, and they ask God who they should go and speak to next, and then they do it. And this is a country where if they mishear that, then they are going to jail, or potentially they're at threat of being killed, or they could lose their home and their livelihood. So they are taking huge risks, and they are so completely relying on God. And of course, because it's God who builds the church, that really is the key for why they're growing. However, there's some other things that we can learn, not just from the Iranian church, but actually from churches that are multiplying worldwide. The one key thing that they have in common is that they focus on discipleship. And that's absolutely key. So this article I was reading about the Iranian church, they spoke of it like this. They said, we don't try and convert people. We disciple them. That is what we do. We disciple them. And if you disciple people, you get conversions. Because that's what happens. And that's kind of like what I'm talking about this diagram. So sometimes understanding these ideas can be easier when you move them into a different context. So if we look at our end goal diagram in Iran, then actually what you may be doing is moving somebody from here who has heard lots of very negative things about the West and the Christian church and what the Christian God is like. And they've grown up as a Muslim, particular identities and stuff. So actually, what the church is doing is challenging and changing that assumption and showing who Jesus is and his power that moves people along. And as they move along, they start to come to know Jesus and become his followers. And so it's discipleship right from that point through. I think that's really interesting. So in essence, what I've basically gone through is, for me, some of the ways in which understanding the perspective of the historical church and also the current worldwide church can change our perspective on where we sit. In addition, our understanding of the culture that we're living in is absolutely crucial in changing our perspective in who we are as a church and what we're called to do. So I've gone very quickly through a lot of quite complicated concepts. I know what I'm trying to say, but if anything I've said doesn't make sense, or if you disagree, that's absolutely fine. Please feel free to come and speak to me about it anytime, or chat amongst yourself in house group. I've got a couple of questions just to finish with that you can talk about just now. So the first one is really important. Have you got God's perspective in your life at the moment? Are you making sure that it's through God's eyes that you're seeing? And if not, take this opportunity this Sunday to make sure that you get that back in sync. It's so important. And everything else that we've said won't matter. It doesn't matter how well you understand the social context or the historical church. If you are not getting yourself and making sure that you understand where you fit in terms of where God is, then you're going to be having a problem. The next three are a lot simpler. So does understanding the history of the church put our situation in perspective, to put our current situation in perspective of where we are as a church, and how? Next, did the statistics I read out surprise you? Maybe they didn't. They certainly surprised me. That 85% is constantly sitting with me at the moment as a a burden or a drive? I don't know what the word is. Anyway, do those statistics, do they change your perspective on church and what our mission should and could be? And finally, what does the Iranian and the persecuted church perspective teach you or challenge you about today? So thank you for listening. I appreciate I've gone on a while. And be interested to know your thoughts on those questions.